Hey, Dansplainers, and welcome back for another deep dive with us.
It's great to be here.
You know, sometimes it feels like every time you're scrolling through the news these days, trying to stay informed, you always see terms like communism and fascism.
Yeah.
And they're always used as these like insults or accusations. But what do these terms actually even mean?
It's true.
It feels like everyone's using them, but nobody's really taking the time to understand them.
Yeah, these ideologies, they're often used as like simplistic labels, but they actually represent really complex historical movements with, actual real-world consequences.
Right.
And I think to really understand their significance, we have to move beyond just slogans and explore like the nuances a little more.
Right. It's like everyone's just talking at each other.
Yeah.
Not really with each other.
Right.
So today on the show, we're going to try to like untangle this whole communism versus fascism debate.
Okay.
We're going to break down their core principles. We'll look at how they actually played out in history and hopefully maybe even bust some myths along the way.
Yeah, I think the goal is to provide like clarity, right? Not just overload you with even more information.
Right.
So think of this like a cheat sheet to understanding two of the most influential and often misunderstood ideologies of the 20th century.
Okay, so let's start with communism first.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people, they hear the word communism, they immediately have this image in their head of like, a world without billionaires, where everybody kind of shares everything equally.
Right.
Like this utopian society where everybody contributes what they can and they get what they need.
Yeah. I mean, that's the ideal, right? At least in theory.
Yeah.
The foundation of communist theory, really going back to Marx and Engels, was rooted in this idea of class struggle.
Okay.
They saw history as like this constant conflict between those who control the means of production, so like the factory owners.
The landowners.
Landowners, exactly, and those who work for them. And communism, in their view, was about, dismantling the system of exploitation.
So it's not just about like redistributing the wealth.
Yeah.
It's about a much more fundamental shift in how society is like organized.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, the abolition of private property is a core principle of communism.
Okay.
So instead of like individuals owning factories, land, or resources, the idea is that those things should be owned and controlled, collectively.
By the workers.
By the workers, right.
Okay, but wouldn't that kind of stifle individual ambition and innovation?
Right.
If there's no like reward for working harder.
Yeah.
Or coming up with new ideas, wouldn't people just kind of slack off?
Yeah, this is one of the key criticisms, right, of communism, and it's a question that different communist thinkers have kind of wrestled with over the years.
Right.
Some have argued that, just the sense of community and like shared purpose, that would be enough to motivate people, while others have acknowledged that you probably need some form of incentives.
Yeah.
To encourage productivity.
It's a tricky balance for sure.
It is.
And I mean, and this whole revolution that they envisioned it wasn't meant to be confined to a single country, right?
Right.
It was much more global, like this internationalist ambition.
Absolutely. Marx and Engels believed that, the working class, they had more in common with each other across national borders than they did with like the ruling classes within their own countries.
Right.
And they really saw like a worldwide revolution as the only way to achieve like true liberation.
For all workers.
For all workers, exactly.
Okay, so, but when we're talking about like overthrowing the existing order, right? How does that actually happen? Does everybody just magically agree to share everything?
Yeah, well, that's where the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat comes in.
Oh, yeah.
Which, it's kind of a loaded term.
Yeah.
But the idea is that it's like a transitional phase.
Okay.
Where the working class, after they've seized power, they kind of use the state to dismantle the old capitalist structures.
Right.
And lay the groundwork for a truly communist society.
Okay, so I can see how that dictatorship part might raise a few eyebrows.
Definitely.
So the idea isn't to like establish a permanent authoritarian regime,
right,
but more like this temporary period of controlled change.
That's the theory, right?
Yeah.
At least that's how it's presented.
Okay.
But as we'll see, I think when we look at the historical examples, this concept has been open to a lot of interpretation, and it has often led to very different outcomes.
That makes sense. We'll definitely get into those real world examples a little bit later.
Yeah.
But first I want to kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about fascism.
Okay.
Because if communism is about kind of breaking down barriers between classes, fascism seems to be more about building them up.
Right.
but based on like national or racial identity.
You've hit on like a really key distinction there.
Yeah.
Fascism, it really thrives on this powerful sense of belonging to a nation or to like a specific racial group, often claiming some sort of like superiority over others. It promises like a return to some mythical past of national greatness, but at the expense of, you know, individual liberties and minority rights.
It's like they're both kind of looking at the same problem.
Right.
Inequality and social unrest. But coming up with like completely opposite solutions.
Exactly, where communism wants to like eliminate class differences. Fascism seems to like embrace and even intensify them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that difference is reflected in their political structures as well, right?
Right. Absolutely. Fascism is inherently authoritarian.
Yeah.
Right from the start. It places all the power in the hands of like a single charismatic leader.
Okay.
Who's supposed to like embody the will of the nation.
So there's no pretense of like a temporary dictatorship here.
Right.
It's about establishing a permanent hierarchy with a strong man at the top.
Precisely. Fascism rejects the idea of democratic pluralism and individual rights. It sees them as like weaknesses that undermine national unity.
Okay.
So it demands complete obedience to the leader.
Right.
And the state often resorting to things like propaganda scapegoating and violence to suppress any kind of dissent.
Yeah. That sounds pretty intense.
It can be.
So besides like the extreme nationalism and authoritarianism, what are some of the other like key ingredients of fascist ideology?
Well, militarism is a core component.
Okay.
War and conquest are seen as ways to, you know, revitalize the nation.
Right.
Assert dominance and expand territory. And to fuel this kind of military machine, the state exerts a lot of control over the economy.
Okay.
Directing resources towards military production and often implementing what are called corporatist systems, where businesses and labor are, you know, very tightly controlled to serve the national interest.
So it's not just about national pride.
Right.
It's also about mobilizing the entire society.
Yes.
For war and conquest.
That's a major part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fascism really thrives on this sense of like collective purpose and sacrifice, you know, often demanding that individuals submit their own interests to the will of the nation.
Yeah.
And this often leads to suppression of individual freedoms, critical thinking, and any voices that kind of challenge the dominant narrative.
It's a stark contrast to the utopian vision of communism.
It is.
Even though both systems, as we've kind of seen, can end up being pretty controlling.
Right.
In practice.
That's an important point to remember, and we'll delve deeper into those parallels a little bit later on.
Okay.
But for now, I think we should move on to kind of the historical implementations of these ideologies and see how these theoretical concepts actually played out in the real world.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Let's start with communism. I think most people, when they hear the word communism, the first thing that pops into their head is the Soviet Union.
Yeah, it's certainly the most well-known example, and for good reason. The Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 led to the creation of the world's first communist state.
Right.
And it really sent shockwaves throughout the globe, and this wasn't just like a brief experiment.
Right.
The Soviet Union was a major world power for decades.
It's fascinating to me how this system that was supposed to liberate the working class
Right.
ended up being so closely associated with authoritarian rule
Yeah.
and economic inefficiency.
What happened?
Really, what happened there?
Well, I mean, the Soviet model, which was based on centralized planning and rapid industrialization.
Okay.
You know, it did achieve some successes.
Okay.
I mean, it lifted millions of people out of poverty and made significant advances in like science and technology. But it also came at a very high cost.
Yeah.
Both in terms of human rights and economic sustainability.
Right.
You know, the suppression of dissent, the forced collectivization of agriculture, and just kind of the inherent inefficiencies of a centrally planned economy. You know, those all eventually led to the system's collapse.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of an example of how the reality of governing a complex society often clashes with like the purity of these ideological ideals.
That's a recurring theme, I think, that we'll see play out again and again.
But, you know, the Soviet Union, while a major turning point in history, is just one example of how communist ideas were implemented.
Right.
I mean, Maoist China, for instance, adapted Marxist theory to a largely agrarian
Yeah.
context, which led to a very different set of policies and outcomes.
Right. And those weren't exactly without controversy either.
No.
I'm thinking of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah.
Like massive social experiments
Right.
that aimed to kind of transform Chinese society, but ended up causing widespread hardship and suffering.
Those are really stark reminders, I think, of the human cost of radical social engineering.
Yeah.
But, it's important to remember that communism took root in various forms in other countries as well.
Right.
Each with its own kind of unique story.
Right.
Cuba, Vietnam, North Korea. Each of these countries adapted Marxist ideas to their specific contexts with varying degrees of success and failure. It seems like a common thread, though, is that these regimes, despite their initial promises of equality and liberation,
Right.
they often ended up being quite authoritarian
Yeah.
and repressive.
That's a pattern that we can't ignore.
Right.
And it raises some important questions, I think, about the challenges of implementing these really radical ideologies and, the potential for power to corrupt even the most well-intentioned movements.
All right, so let's turn our attention to fascism now.
Okay.
When we talk about fascism, I think the first thing that comes to mind for a lot of people is Nazi Germany. And it's like a really chilling example of how this fascist ideology can lead to just truly horrific consequences.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The rise of the Nazi Party under Adolf Hitler is, a tragic chapter in human history.
Yeah.
And despite having socialist in its name,
Right.
the Nazi regime was fundamentally nationalist, racist, and vehemently anti-communist.
Yeah, it's important to remember that the Holocaust, this systematic genocide that claimed the lives of millions of Jews and other minorities,
Right.
was a direct result of Nazi ideology.
Yes.
It's a stark warning, I think,
It is.
about the dangers of unchecked hatred and the importance of safeguarding human rights.
It's a lesson that we must never forget.
Yeah.
The atrocities committed by the Nazi regime are a permanent stain on human history and a constant reminder of the fragility of civilization.
Yeah.
And I think the need to be vigilant against all forms of extremism.
It's a heavy topic,
It is.
but one that I think we can't afford to shy away from.
Right.
So besides Nazi Germany, what are some other notable examples of fascism in action?
Well, Benito Mussolini's fascist Italy
Okay.
is another key example, and it was actually the first fascist state,
Oh, wow.
establishing a model that other fascist movements would later emulate.
Wow, okay.
And Mussolini's regime emphasized aggressive nationalism, a corporate economic system where the state controlled key industries.
And a glorification of war and violence.
It's interesting how these fascist regimes,
Right.
despite their differences in context,
Yeah.
they seem to share these common threads.
Right.
The cult of personality around the leader, the aggressive expansionism, the suppression of dissent. It's like they're all kind of following a similar playbook.
That's a very keen observation, and these are indeed, I think, hallmarks of fascist rule.
Right.
And what's concerning is that, we're seeing a resurgence
Yeah.
of far-right movements in recent years that echo many of these dangerous historical patterns.
Yeah. It's a chilling thought. It's almost as if history is roaming, even if it's not repeating itself exactly.
Right.
The rise of populism, nationalism, xenophobia
Yeah.
in various parts of the world raises, I think, serious questions about the ongoing relevance of fascist ideology
Right.
and the potential for it to kind of reemerge in new and dangerous forms.
It's a reminder that we can't afford to be complacent.
Yeah.
The lessons of the past are, I think, more relevant than ever
Right.
in a world where these ideologies are once again gaining some traction.
All right. So we've kind of laid out the basics of communism and fascism.
Yeah.
Explored some of their historical manifestations and even touched on some of their chilling parallels.
Right.
But before we spiral into existential dread,
Yeah. Good idea.
let's take a step back and try to make sense of it all.
Now that we've explored the theoretical foundations and the historical manifestations of both communism and fascism, I think we should do a little bit more of a comparative analysis to kind of identify their key similarities and differences.
Okay, so what does this all mean?
Right.
How do we make sense of these two ideologies that seem so different
Right.
on the surface,
Yeah.
but also have resulted in such similar forms of oppression?
Well, I think one of the most fundamental differences lies in their ideological goals?
Communism, at its core, aims to eliminate class distinctions altogether.
Right.
It kind of envisions this classless, stateless society where everyone contributes according to their ability and receives according to their needs.
It's that utopian vision again.
Exactly.
The pursuit of, like, true equality.
Fascism, on the other hand, isn't about equality at all.
Right.
It embraces hierarchy, and it seeks to establish a very rigid social order
Okay.
that's often based on national or racial purity.
So communism wants to kind of level the playing field,
Right.
while fascism wants to create a very specific playing field with very clear winners and losers.
Precisely. And this difference is reflected in their approach to economic organization as well.
Okay.
Communism advocates for the complete abolition of private property,
Right.
with the means of production being owned and controlled collectively, theoretically, for the benefit of all.
A pretty radical departure, I think,
Yeah,
from the capitalist systems that we're used to.
indeed. Fascism, while not necessarily opposed to private property,
Okay.
demands that all economic activities
Right.
must serve the national interest.
Right.
So this often involves a high degree of state control and a corporatist system where the government basically dictates
Okay.
the roles of various industries and labor groups.
So it's less about who owns the property.
Right.
And more about who gets to call the shots.
Exactly. And their views on the state also differ significantly.
Okay.
Now, in theory, the communist state is meant to be a temporary instrument.
Right.
It eventually withers away once a classless society has been achieved.
That whole dictatorship of the proletariat thing
Right.
being a means to an end.
Yes.
Right.
However, as we've seen, communist regimes in practice have tended to be highly centralized and authoritarian, often clinging to power
Right.
long after that supposed transition phase.
Yeah, power tends to have that effect on people regardless of their ideology.
Indeed, fascism, on the other hand, is inherently authoritarian from the outset.
Right.
It vests ultimate power in a single leader and views the state as a permanent instrument of control.
Mm-hmm.
That's essential for maintaining order and achieving national greatness.
So no pretense of like a temporary power grab here.
Right.
It's about establishing a permanent hierarchy with a strong man at the top.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Finally, their social and cultural orientations, I think, also differ significantly.
Yep.
Communism emphasizes international solidarity among the working class.
Okay.
Right. It sees national borders as like these artificial barriers
Right.
and envisions a future where workers of all nations unite
Mm-hmm.
in a global revolution.
That workers of the world unite
Yeah,
slogan.
exactly.
We often hear.
Fascism, in stark contrast, fixates on national or racial identity.
Right.
And it often invokes these cultural or religious symbols to promote unity
Right.
within the chosen group
Uh-huh.
and to justify the exclusion and often persecution of those deemed outsiders.
So one is all about breaking down barriers between people,
Right.
and the other is about building them up.
Exactly.
Pretty clear distinctions, I think.
On paper, the differences are quite stark.
Yeah.
However, when we look at their historical implementations,
Right.
things get a little bit more complicated.
Okay.
That's where I think some of the unexpected similarities start to emerge.
But here's the twist.
Despite their kind of diametrically opposed goals and ideologies, both communism and fascism, as they played out in the 20th century,
Right.
exhibited certain totalitarian tendencies.
It's almost like they're two sides of the same authoritarian coin, even though their motivations are completely different.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
Both systems in practice have often resulted in centralized control,
Right.
suppressing individual rights in favor of the collective or the state.
So it's not just about what they believe in.
Right.
It's about how they actually go about achieving their goals.
Exactly.
That makes them seem so similar.
Exactly. Take, for example, their approach to dissent.
Mm-hmm.
Both communist and fascist regimes have historically shown very low tolerance
Right.
for any form of opposition.
Yeah.
They've employed extensive propaganda censorship and often brutal force to silence critics
Right.
and maintain a very tight grip on power.
Yeah, and let's not forget about the whole cult of personality
Right.
that often emerges around leaders
Yeah.
in both types of regimes.
Right. You think about Stalin, Mao, Hitler, Mussolini. They may have had different ideologies,
Right.
but they all seem to share a penchant for self-aggrandizement and a need to control every aspect of their citizens' lives.
That's a key similarity that often, I think, gets overlooked.
It does.
And maybe the most striking parallel of all is their shared rejection of liberal democracy.
Right.
Right? Both communism and fascism, despite their, vastly different visions for society,
Yes.
ultimately aim to concentrate power in the hands of a select few.
Right.
Whether it's a party elite
Yeah.
or a single charismatic leader.
Exactly. They see liberal democracy as an obstacle to achieving their goals.
Right.
A weak and inefficient system
Right.
that must be replaced with something more decisive,
Right.
more unified, more,
Absolute.
it's a sobering reminder that the road to hell, as they say, can be paved with good intentions.
Right.
Or at least with the belief that you have the right answer for everyone.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I think it's important to kind of clear up some of the common misconceptions that often swirl around these complex ideologies.
It's crucial to dispel these oversimplifications and encourage, I think, a more nuanced understanding of history.
All right, so let's tackle this head on.
One of the most common mistakes I think people make is using communism and fascism as simple synonyms for totalitarianism.
Right.
As if they're just two interchangeable flavors of the same oppressive system.
That's a dangerous oversimplification.
Okay.
While both ideologies, have exhibited totalitarian tendencies in practice, their underlying goals, their motivations and their methods of control are fundamentally different.
Okay.
It's not just about the end result.
Right.
It's about the journey that gets you there.
Okay, that makes sense.
Right.
Another persistent myth, I think, is that Nazi Germany was actually a form of communism. The whole National Socialist bit in their party name, I think, throws people off.
Yeah, that's a common misconception.
Yeah.
But a deeply misleading one.
Okay.
Despite the name, Nazi ideology was vehemently anti-communist.
Okay.
The Nazis despised Marxist internationalism and saw class struggle as a threat to national unity.
So it's all about focusing on racial purity and national strength.
Exactly.
Not on, liberating the working class.
The Nazis saw themselves as locked in this battle against communism for the soul of Europe.
Okay.
And they weren't shy about expressing their hatred for the ideology.
And yet another myth that I think needs debunking is this idea that both communism and fascism are aiming for some sort of utopian society, as if they're both striving for a perfect world, just through different means.
That's a fundamental misunderstanding of their core principles. While communism does envision this utopian end state, this classless, stateless society where everybody lives in harmony, fascism has no such aspirations.
Well, it's not about creating a paradise on Earth. It's more about restoring a mythical past, achieving national dominance.
Exactly.
And kind of enforcing this rigid social order.
Fascism is inherently about power and control, about elevating a specific group at the expense of others.
Okay.
It's a fundamentally different vision from the more egalitarian aspirations of communism, even if both systems have often resulted in similar forms of oppression. Even if both systems have often resulted in similar forms of oppression in practice, there's always more to uncover when we're dealing with these ideologies that have shaped so much of our world. And I find that, delving into the specifics sometimes really helps to connect these grand theories to the everyday realities of people's lives.
Yeah, I totally agree. You know what always strikes me is how even seemingly small details can reveal so much about how these systems actually function. Did you know that propaganda posters were a huge deal in the Soviet Union?
Oh, yeah?
They weren't just informational. They were practically an art form.
It's true. Propaganda played a central role in both communist and fascist regimes. It was a really powerful tool, I think, for shaping public perception, building support for the government, and also demonizing enemies. And in the Soviet case, these posters often depicted heroic workers, idealized scenes of industrial progress, and slogans promising a brighter future under communism.
Yeah, I've seen some of them. They're very striking.
Yeah.
Bold colors, dynamic compositions.
Mm-hmm.
You can almost like feel the energy and optimism that they were trying to convey.
They were designed to evoke that emotional response,
Right.
to inspire people to work harder,
Mm-hmm.
to believe in the communist ideal.
Okay.
And on the flip side, they were also used to portray capitalism
Right.
as a system of greed, exploitation, and inevitable decline.
So it wasn't just about promoting their own ideology. It was also about actively undermining like the alternative.
Absolutely. And the Nazis were masters of propaganda as well.
Right.
They used every available medium, radio, film, newspapers, massive rallies to spread their message of racial purity, national unity, and hatred towards those they deemed enemies of the state.
Speaking of those rallies, I mean, there was something else.
Oh, yeah.
Hundreds of thousands of people, all perfectly synchronized, chanting slogans, saluting.
Mm-hmm.
It's both mesmerizing and terrifying to watch footage of those events.
Those rallies were meticulously staged spectacles of power
Right.
and intimidation designed to create a sense of awe and blind obedience.
Yeah.
And they played a key role, I think, in reinforcing that cult of personality around Hitler,
Right.
portraying him as this godlike figure leading the nation to its destiny.
It's crazy how these seemingly small details, posters, rallies, can reveal so much about the inner workings of these systems.
They provide, I think, a glimpse into the mindset, the strategies, the ways in which these regimes sought to control not just people's actions,
Right.
but their thoughts and emotions as well.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about the big events. It's also about the lived experiences of the people who are caught up in these ideologies.
Absolutely. And speaking of those lived experiences, I think we should also talk about the economic experiments that were undertaken by these regimes. In the Soviet Union, for example, there was this massive push to collectivize agriculture, to bring all the farmland under state control.
The idea being that shared ownership would lead to increased efficiency and productivity.
Exactly. But the reality was far more complicated. You know, this forced collectivization led to widespread resistance from farmers, disruption of traditional farming practices, and ultimately a sharp decline in agricultural output.
It sounds like another example of ideology clashing with practical reality.
It certainly highlights the challenges, I think, of implementing such radical economic transformations. And it wasn't just the Soviet Union that experimented with, unconventional economic policies.
Right.
Maoist China, during the Great Leap Forward, attempted to rapidly industrialize the country through a series of ambitious but ultimately poorly planned initiatives.
That was the campaign that led to the infamous backyard steel furnaces, right?
Yes.
Where people were melting down their pots and pans
Exactly.
to try and meet these production quotas.
It was a massive mobilization of labor and resources, but it ultimately resulted in economic chaos, widespread famine, and millions of deaths.
It seems like these grand schemes, whether driven by communist or fascist ideology, often overlook the human cost and the complexities of real-world economics.
That's a key takeaway, and it's important to remember that these regimes weren't just experimenting within their own borders. The Cold War, which dominated much of the 20th century, was a global ideological struggle between the communist Soviet Union and the capitalist West.
It was a time of immense tension and uncertainty.
Yeah.
The whole world was basically holding its breath, wondering if these two superpowers were going to end up destroying each other.
It was a period of proxy wars, espionage, and a constant arms race with both sides vying for influence and control around the globe. And even though the Soviet Union eventually collapsed, the ripple effects of that era are still being felt today.
We're still dealing with the legacy of those conflicts, the political divisions, the economic disparities, even the environmental damage.
Absolutely. And I think the impact goes beyond just geopolitics. The economic policies, social reforms, even the psychological scars left by these regimes continue to shape the lives of millions of people around the world.
Yeah, it's a reminder that these aren't just abstract ideologies from the past. They've had a real and lasting impact on the world we live in today.
They have.
But with all this talk of oppression and conflict, are there any positive legacies we can point to?
That's a good question, and one that I think often gets overlooked. While it's crucial to acknowledge the very real negative consequences of these ideologies, it's also important, I think, to recognize that they did inspire some positive social changes. For example, communist movements played a significant role in advancing workers' rights and social welfare programs in many countries.
I guess even in their failures, these movements pushed societies to grapple with issues of inequality and social justice.
Exactly. They forced people to confront the shortcomings of
Yeah.
existing systems
Right.
and to imagine alternative ways of organizing society.
Right.
And while those alternatives may not have always worked out as intended, they did contribute to important debates and reforms
Right.
that continue to shape our world today.
So even though these ideologies, have a lot of baggage, we can still learn from them,
Absolutely.
both from their successes and their failures.
I think understanding the history of communism and fascism is essential for making sense of current events,
Right.
political debates, and social movements around the world.
Mm-hmm.
These ideologies, despite all their flaws and complexities,
Right.
continue to inform our values, our fears, our hopes for the future.
And with the rise of populism, nationalism, and authoritarianism in various parts of the world,
Yeah.
it seems like these ideologies are more relevant than ever.
It's a concerning trend, no doubt. It's a reminder that we must remain vigilant against all forms of extremism, intolerance, and the erosion of democratic values.
Right.
The lessons of the 20th century, I think, are as important as ever in the 21st.
So where do we go from here?
Right.
What's like the most important thing we should take away from this deep dive into communism and fascism?
I think the key takeaway is the importance of nuance and critical thinking.
Okay.
We can't simply reduce these ideologies to simplistic labels
Right.
or good versus evil narratives. We have to understand their historical context, their diverse manifestations, their successes and failures, and their lasting legacies.
So it's about acknowledging the complexities, both the good and the bad.
Yeah.
And avoiding oversimplifications.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that even seemingly utopian ideals can have unintended consequences. And that power, regardless of ideology, can be a corrupting force.
Sounds like the key is to be informed, to think critically, and to be wary of anyone who claims to have all the answers.
That's a wise approach, I think, to navigating the complexities of history and the challenges of our present moment.
I think that's a great place to pause. For now, we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
But I feel like there's still so much more to discuss. It's definitely been a thought-provoking journey. And I got to say, I'm feeling a lot less confused about these terms now.
That's what we aim for.
It's funny. Before we started this deep dive, I kind of saw communism and fascism as these relics of the past.
Yeah.
Something we learned about in a history class.
Yeah.
And then just kind of moved on from... But now I'm seeing their fingerprints everywhere.
It's true.
In current political debates, in social movements, even in the way we talk about issues like inequality and power.
These ideologies continue to cast a long shadow.
Yeah.
And that's precisely why it's so important to understand them, not just as these historical phenomena, but as these living forces that continue to shape our world.
It's like they become part of our collective vocabulary, even if we don't always use the terms accurately.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where the danger lies.
Yeah.
In reducing these complex ideologies to simplistic labels and using them as blunt instruments to attack opponents or shut down debate.
So I guess the key takeaway here is it's not enough to just know the definitions of these terms.
It's about understanding the nuances.
Right.
The historical context, the different ways these ideologies have been implemented, and the consequences, both positive and negative, they've had.
It's about recognizing that these weren't just abstract theories.
Yeah.
They were real-world experiments. With real human costs and real human stories.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest takeaway for me, that history isn't just this collection of dates and events. It's about the choices that people made, the beliefs they held, and the impact those choices and beliefs had on the course of human events.
It's about understanding that the past is not truly past. It's still shaping our present and our future.
So what's the best way for us to kind of learn from these historical lessons? What can we do to prevent the mistakes of the past from being repeated?
I think the most important thing is to foster critical thinking, to encourage open dialogue, and to be wary of any ideology that claims to have all the answers.
It's about questioning assumptions,
Yes.
challenging narratives, being willing to engage with different perspectives.
It's about recognizing the dangers of extremism, intolerance, and the suppression of dissent.
It's about defending democratic values, protecting human rights, and ensuring that the lessons of the past are not forgotten.
Absolutely. And ultimately, I think it's about recognizing our shared humanity,
Mm-hmm.
our common vulnerabilities, and our responsibility to create a world where all people have the opportunity to live in dignity and freedom.
Wow, that's powerful.
Mhm.
And it feels like a perfect note to end on.
Yeah.
This deep dive has been eye-opening, challenging, and ultimately, I think, really important.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
Likewise.
And I hope it sparked some thought-provoking conversations for our listeners as well.
And speaking of sparking conversations, I want to remind everyone to head over to www.dansplain.xyz for more insightful content.
You'll find all the latest Dansplain episodes, thought-provoking articles, and even some partner products that might pique your interest.
So keep those brains engaged, Dansplainers.
Stay curious.
Stay informed, and never stop questioning the world around you.
Never stop questioning.
Until next time, happy listening.